The wagon lurched to a stop at Fort Laramie's outer post, and Caroline Wolfe knew with cold certainty that she had reached the edge of everything familiar. The wheels grinding against packed earth like the closing of a door she could never reopen behind her. The September sun bore down merciless on the Wyoming plains, turning the fort into a shimmer of heat and dust, bleaching the wooden structures until they seemed half ghost, half memory. Caroline pressed her black-gloved hand against the weathered trunk beside her, steadying herself as the driver called out in a voice roughened by whiskey and years. "End of the line, ma'am," he said not unkindly, but with the finality of a man who had delivered many souls to uncertain fates. She was the last passenger, the others having departed at Cheyenne and smaller stations along the way, their eyes sliding away from her mourning dress, from the shadow that seemed to follow her like a second skin. Widow women carried bad luck, or so the whispers went, especially young widows, especially ones traveling alone to marry strangers in territories where civilization frayed at the edges. The journey from Philadelphia had taken 3 weeks, each mile stripping away another layer of the life she had known. First the train to Omaha, crowded with immigrants and speculators, then the stagecoach west, rattling over roads that grew rougher with each passing day. Caroline had watched it all through dusty windows, feeling herself becoming smaller with each passing hour. Caroline gathered her carpet bag and the small wooden case that held everything remaining of her former life. 2 dresses besides the black one she wore, both faded and mended at the seams. Her dead husband's pocket watch, the only thing of value he had not gambled away. A daguerreotype of her mother, stern-faced and proper, dead these 10 years. And the marriage contract signed by a man she had never met, a Lakota war chief named Thashichamnam, called Iron Shell by the traders and soldiers who could not shape their tongues around his true name. The fort bustled with controlled chaos, soldiers drilling in the yard, their boots raising clouds of dust that caught the afternoon light. Traders haggled over furs and ammunition, their voices sharp with the edge of men who knew profit and loss in their bones. Lakota people moved through the spaces between, some wrapped in traditional dress of soft leather and beadwork, others in awkward combinations of native and white clothing that looked like compromises, neither side truly accepted. The mingling of worlds created a tension Caroline could taste on her tongue, metallic and sharp, like the moment before lightning strikes. This was the frontier, the bleeding edge where cultures collided and mixed and sometimes destroyed each other. Treaties were signed here, promises made and broken, lives traded like commodities. She stepped down from the wagon, her boots sinking slightly into dust that had been ground fine by thousands of feet, horses, wagons, the endless traffic of empire pushing westward over land that belonged to others first. Men turned to look, some with curiosity, others with something harder in their eyes, calculating, judging. A widow bride was desperate by definition, and desperation made some men cruel. One soldier, young and sunburned, elbowed his companion and said something that made them both laugh. Caroline felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral, her mother's training holding firm even now. A lady does not acknowledge crude behavior. To do so gives it power, Mrs. Wolfe. The voice came from her left, accented but clear, belonging to a man in his middle years wearing the blue coat of an army interpreter. His face weathered to leather by sun and wind, his eyes kind despite the hardness the frontier carved into everyone eventually. "I'm Joseph Renville," he said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "I've been sent to bring you to the treaty grounds." Caroline's throat tightened. The treaty grounds, not the fort itself, not even the relative safety of the trading post. She had known this would not be a traditional arrangement, had understood when she signed the papers in Philadelphia that she was not simply marrying a man, but stepping into a world most white women never entered willingly. "Mr. Renville," she said, managing to keep her voice steady, "thank you for meeting me." He studied her with careful assessment but without cruelty. "You're younger than I expected," he said finally, "and you've come a long way." "I am 20 years old," Caroline replied, "and yes, I have come from Philadelphia." Renville nodded slowly. "The journey is one thing, Mrs. Wolf, but what comes after may be harder still." He gestured toward the distant encampment visible along the river. "Tashi Chamna is a good man, a respected war chief, but his world and yours are not the same. I understand that. Do you—" He asked it gently but with genuine doubt. "Forgive my bluntness, ma'am, but most white women who come west expect to bring civilization with them. They expect the land and the people to bend." He paused. "That will not happen here." Caroline met his eyes directly. "Mr. Renville, I am a widow with no family, no prospects, and debts I could not pay. My husband's brother sought to make me his mistress to satisfy those debts, and the law would have allowed it." She kept her voice level despite the shame that still burned. When the missionary brought the proposal from Tashi Chamna, it was the only door that opened. "I do not expect comfort. I do not expect ease. I expect only a chance to survive with my dignity intact." Something shifted in Renville's expression, a softening that suggested he had not expected such directness. "Then you may have a better chance than most," he said quietly. "Come, we should go before the light fails." He took her trunk without asking, gesturing toward a sturdy horse already saddled and waiting. Caroline had ridden as a girl in Pennsylvania, before her father's debts swallowed their farm, before financial ruin forced them into Philadelphia's narrow streets. She had loved those days, the freedom of galloping through open fields. Wind tangling her hair, she mounted without assistance, ignoring the surprised glances from nearby soldiers who had assumed she would need help. Her morning dress was impractical for riding, but she managed it with grace born of childhood practice. Renville swung onto his own horse with easy competence as they rode through the fort's gates, leaving behind the last outpost of the world Caroline had known. Renville spoke. "Tashi Chamna requested a white wife for practical reasons, Mrs. Wolf. His people need someone who can read and write in English, who understands how the government agents think, who can help negotiate the impossible situation they find themselves in. And why would he trust a white woman to do this honestly? Because he believes some people can be honorable, even across the divide of culture." Renville's voice carried both admiration and sadness. "And because he has no choice, the treaties are written in English. The promises made and broken in a language his people are only beginning to learn." What happened to his first wife? She died 3 winters ago, bringing their son into the world. The pain in Renville's voice was genuine. The child died too, both taken by fever when the snows came early, and the medicine man could do nothing. Caroline felt her heart constrict. She knew that grief, the hollow emptiness of losing someone you should have been able to save. "I'm sorry, he has mourned properly according to Lakota custom." Renville continued. "Now he seeks to rebuild. But he wants a partner who understands the world that presses in on his people. Not a decoration, not a comfort, a partner." The Lakota encampment spread along the North Platte River like something from a dream or a nightmare, depending on one's perspective. Dozens of lodges rose against the autumn sky, their painted surfaces telling stories Caroline could not yet read, smoke curling from their peaks in lazy spirals. Children ran between them with dogs yapping at their heels, their laughter bright and unmistakable in any language. Women worked at tasks Caroline recognized, even if she did not know the specifics. Scraping hides, preparing food, tending fires. The sound of women singing drifted on the wind, rhythmic and haunting. Nothing like the hymns Caroline had grown up with in Philadelphia's Presbyterian churches. This music felt older, connected to the earth and sky in ways her own faith had somehow lost. People paused to watch as they passed, their faces showing everything from curiosity to suspicion to carefully maintained neutrality. Caroline felt the weight of dozens of eyes, felt herself being measured, judged, found wanting perhaps. She held her spine straight, her mother's voice echoing in memory. "Dignity costs nothing and buys everything. Wear it like armor and they cannot touch what matters." A group of young warriors stood near the horse herd, their bodies painted for what Caroline assumed was some ceremony. They watched her pass with expressions that ranged from hostile to merely cold. One said something in Lakota that made the others laugh. Harsh and mocking. Renville's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Just urged his horse forward. "What did he say?" Caroline asked quietly. "Nothing worth repeating. Tell me anyway." "He said you look like a crow in that black dress, that perhaps you bring death with you." Renville glanced at her. "They lost family to white soldiers, Mrs. Wolfe. Their anger is not personal to you, but you will bear it nonetheless." Caroline nodded, understanding more than he perhaps expected. She had been blamed for Thomas's death by his family, as if her presence had somehow cursed him. Renville led her to a lodge, set slightly apart from the others. Larger than most, its surface painted with images of horses and warriors, symbols Caroline could not decipher. The colors were rich, even faded by sun and weather, reds and blacks and yellows that caught the late afternoon light. He dismounted and spoke in Lakota to someone inside, the language rolling and complex, full of sounds English never touched. Caroline remained mounted, uncertain of protocol, unwilling to presume. A woman emerged first, perhaps 40 years old, her face marked with traditional tattoos that ran along her chin in delicate lines. Her dress of soft deerhide, decorated with intricate quill work that must have taken hundreds of hours. Her eyes assessed Caroline with the shrewdness of someone who had survived too much to be easily impressed. This was not hostility exactly, but it was not welcome either. It was the wariness of someone who had learned that strangers brought change, and change was rarely kind. Then he appeared. The Shichamna stood taller than any man Caroline had ever seen, easily 6 feet and more. His shoulders broad beneath a shirt of pale leather, decorated with beadwork across the chest. His long black hair hung loose past his shoulders, marked with a single eagle feather bound with red cloth. His face was all sharp planes and angles, high cheekbones and a strong jaw, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness or European standards. Scars marked his arms and chest, visible where his shirt hung open in the heat. The record of battles fought and survived, each one a story she did not yet know how to read. His hands were large, capable, marked with the calluses of a warrior's life. But it was his eyes that held her, dark as river stones worn smooth by time, intelligent and assessing, missing nothing. When those eyes settled on Caroline, she felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing, not threatening but absolute, as if he could see through the black dress and careful composure to the woman beneath, frightened and determined in equal measure. He studied her in silence that stretched too long. Not with the hungry assessment of the men at the fort, but with the careful attention of someone examining something unexpected, something that required reconsideration of previous assumptions. Caroline met his gaze without flinching, though her heart hammered in her chest. She would not look away first, would not show weakness or submission before she understood what was truly being asked of her. Finally, Renville cleared his throat and spoke in Lakota, gesturing to Caroline, then to Shichamna, explaining, translating, bridging the gap between their worlds with words that had to carry impossible weight. The war chief responded, his voice deep and measured, each word chosen with care. His eyes never left Caroline's face. Renville turned to her. "He says you are younger than he expected from the agent's description. He says your eyes carry shadows that speak of grief properly held." Caroline lifted her chin. "Tell him I'm 20 years old. Tell him my husband died 2 winters past of fever. Tell him I have known sorrow, but I am not broken by it." Another exchange in Lakota, longer this time, the Shichamna's eyes never leaving Caroline's face. She saw his expression shift slightly, not quite surprise, but something like interest. "He asks why you agreed to come," Renville translated carefully. "Why a white woman would choose to marry into the Lakota, to leave your people and everything familiar." This was the question Caroline had known would come, the one she had prepared for during the long journey west. She could lie, could speak of adventure or curiosity or some noble desire to bridge cultures. But something in this man's steady gaze demanded truth, unvarnished and complete. "Because I had nothing left," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the space between them. Because my husband left debts I could not pay, because his brother tried to force me into his bed to satisfy those debts, because the law protects men's rights and women are property." She paused, gathering courage. "Because when the missionary brought your proposal, it was the only door that opened, the only choice that let me keep my dignity." Her hands tightened on the reins. "And because the letter you sent through the agent said you wanted a woman who could survive, not one who needed saving, and I'm tired of being seen as something broken that needs fixing." Sir Renville translated slowly, carefully, preserving not just her words but her tone, the steel beneath the surface. Caroline watched Thashichamna's face as he listened, saw something shift in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. He spoke again, more words this time, his voice carrying weight. Renville's translation came slowly. He says honesty is a gift among his people, more valuable than horses or weapons. He says lies poison everything they touch. They destroy trust, and trust is all that keeps people alive in hard times. Renville paused. He says you speak like someone who has learned the world is not kind to those without power. The interpreter continued. He asks if you know what it means to carry a Lakota name, to walk between worlds as neither white nor Lakota, but something between, something both peoples may reject. He asks if you understand that any children born of your union will belong to neither world fully, will face hatred from both sides. Caroline felt her hands trembling and clasped them together. I know it means I will not be welcome in white settlements, that decent women will cross the street rather than speak to me. I know it means your people may never fully accept me, that I will always be the outsider. I know it means any children we have will face a world that has no place for them. She met his eyes directly, refusing to look away. But I also know that I am here, that I chose this with open eyes, and that I do not break easily. I've survived things that should have destroyed me, and I'm still standing. The tattooed woman spoke sharply in Lakota, her tone challenging. Thashichamna responded without looking away from Caroline, his words firm but not angry. Renville shifted uncomfortably. His sister Wichachala says white women are weak, that you will cry for your soft life within a week, that bringing you here insults Lakota women who could share his lodge. Caroline dismounted then, her movements deliberate. She walked closer to Wichachala, close enough to be respectful but not subservient. Tell her, Caroline said steadily, that I buried my husband with my own hands because there was no money for a funeral, that I walked 15 miles through a blizzard to reach the missionary station, that I have scrubbed floors until my hands bled, done whatever was necessary to survive. Her voice hardened. Tell her I do not expect to be welcomed. I expect only to be given a chance to prove myself through my actions, not my words. When Renville translated, the space between them seemed to crackle. Wichachala's expression did not soften, but something like grudging respect flickered in her eyes. She said something short and sharp. She says you have the eyes of a warrior, even if you wear a woman's dress. Renville translated with surprise in his voice. She says time will tell if you have a warrior's heart as well. Then Wichachala turned and walked back into the lodge. Her movements dismissive, Thashichamna spoke directly to Caroline this time, in halting but clear English. You will stay in my sister's lodge tonight, he said, his accent turning the familiar words into something new. Tomorrow we will speak more. Tomorrow you will decide if you truly wish this life. I have decided, Caroline said firmly. He shook his head slowly. You have decided to run from one thing. Now you must decide to run toward another. These are not the same. He gestured toward the lodge. Tonight you rest. Your body is tired from travel, and your spirit needs time to see clearly. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, we talk of what it means to carry my name, what I ask of you, what you may ask of me. This must be a true choice, not just escape. The wisdom in his words struck Caroline deeply. She had been so focused on leaving Philadelphia that she had not truly considered what she was running toward. Renville touched Caroline's elbow gently. Come, I'll help you settle. Wichachala is harsh, but she is fair, and she will not let harm come to you under her roof. That is sacred among the Lakota. As Caroline followed him toward the lodge, gathering her belongings, she felt Tashichamna's gaze on her back, heavy with questions neither of them yet knew how to answer. She had come west expecting a simple transaction, but already she sensed this would be far more complicated. The lodge interior surprised her with its order and beauty. Buffalo hides stretched tight over the willow frame created walls that glowed with afternoon light. A fire pit in the center had been carefully constructed with stones. Backrests made of willow and covered with soft leather leaned against the walls. Sleeping robes of buffalo and deer hide were arranged with precision. The air smelled of sage and smoke and leather, utterly foreign to Caroline's experience. Wichachala sat near the fire, working on quill work, her fingers moving with practiced skill. She did not look up when Caroline entered. Renville spoke to her in Lakota, received a curt nod, then turned to Caroline. She says you may sleep there. He gestured to a space along the western edge. She says if you steal or cause trouble, she will drive you back to the fort herself. Caroline set down her belongings carefully. "Thank you for allowing me into your home," she said, knowing the woman could not understand but hoping the tone would carry meaning. Wichachala said nothing. Returning to her quill work with deliberate dismissal, Renville sighed. "I will return in the morning to help with translation. Tonight rest if you can, tomorrow will be difficult." There is much to discuss, and after he left, Caroline sat on the buffalo robe, her body aching from travel, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. Outside, the sounds of the camp continued. Voices calling in Lakota, horses nickering, the steady rhythm of drums beginning somewhere in the distance. She removed her black traveling dress with stiff fingers, folding it carefully. Underneath, she wore a simple cotton shift, mended but clean. As she began to unbraid her dark hair, working through tangles that 3 weeks of travel had created, she caught Wichachala watching her from across the fire. The older woman said something in Lakota, her tone less harsh than before. Caroline shook her head apologetically. "I do not understand, I'm sorry." Wichachala rose with fluid grace and crossed to her, gesturing at Caroline's hair. She spoke again, accompanied by hand motions that suggested braiding. "You want to braid it differently." Caroline guessed. Wichachala nodded, then with surprising gentleness, took Caroline's hair in her hands and began to work. Her fingers were quick and sure, creating 2 tight braids instead of Caroline's single loose one. The style practical and distinctly Lakota. When she finished, she handed Caroline a small piece of polished metal to use as a mirror. The reflection showed a woman Caroline barely recognized. Her face had grown thinner during the journey, marked by grief and hardship, but her eyes held something new, not hope exactly, but a fierce determination. The braids changed her appearance in subtle ways, made her look less like a proper Eastern widow and more like something between worlds. Wichachala spoke again, softer this time, and though Caroline could not understand the words, she thought she heard something like acknowledgement, perhaps even the faintest hint of approval. "Thank you," Caroline said softly, touching the braids. The older woman returned to her work without further acknowledgement, but the atmosphere in the lodge had shifted, no longer quite so hostile, merely wary. That night, Caroline lay awake on the buffalo robe, staring up at the lodge poles that converged at the smoke hole where stars were visible. She listened to the unfamiliar sounds outside, the wind moving through the camp with a voice different from city winds. Voices singing in the distance, the crackle and pop of many fires. Tomorrow she would speak with Tashichamna again, would learn what he truly wanted, what he expected from a wife who came from a world so different from his own. The thought filled her with equal parts fear and something that felt almost like anticipation. She thought of his question, delivered through Renville's careful translation, "Could you carry my name?" Not would she marry him, not would she share his bed, but could she carry his name, the weight and meaning of it, the responsibility and the consequence? It was a question that demanded more than simple agreement. It asked if she could become something new, something that did not yet exist, a bridge between worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. Caroline pulled the buffalo robe close against the autumn chill that crept in as the fire burned low. She had come west to escape one impossible situation, only to find herself facing another entirely. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, listening to Wichachala's quiet breathing across the lodge, she realized that for the first time in 2 years, she felt something other than numb despair. She felt alive, uncertain and afraid perhaps, but undeniably, fiercely alive. Morning came to the Lakota camp with sounds that pulled Caroline from restless sleep. The low voices of women starting fires, the whinny of horses being led to water, the bark of dogs announcing the new day. She woke disoriented, her body stiff from sleeping on unfamiliar bedding, her mind taking long moments to remember where she was and why. Wichachala was already awake, tending the fire with practiced efficiency, adding small sticks in a pattern that made the flames rise without smoke. She glanced at Caroline but said nothing, her expression as unreadable as it had been the night before. Caroline sat up slowly, running her hands over the braids Wichachala had woven. They had stayed tight through the night, practical in a way her usual style never was. She folded the buffalo robe carefully, trying to match the precise way the other sleeping robes were arranged. Small gestures of respect that words could not convey. Wichachala watched these movements with sharp eyes, then made a sound that might have been approval. She gestured toward a parfleche decorated with geometric designs and spoke in Lakota, her meaning clear even without translation. Food was being offered. "Thank you," Caroline said softly. Moving to where Wichachala indicated, inside the parfleche was pemmican, dried meat pounded with fat and berries, dense and rich. Caroline had never tasted anything like it, the flavor strong and somewhat wild, but not unpleasant. She ate slowly, aware of Wichachala's continued observation, feeling like every gesture was being assessed, judged, catalogued for future reference. When Renville arrived, as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, his presence brought both relief and renewed anxiety. Today would determine everything. Today she would learn what Thashichamna truly expected, what carrying his name would actually mean, beyond the abstract promises in letters and missionary explanations. "Thashichamna waits by the river," Renville said after greeting both women. "He wishes to speak with you away from the camp, where conversation can be private." Caroline's stomach tightened, but she nodded, smoothing her black dress, though it was already as presentable as 3 weeks of travel would allow. She followed Renville through the camp, acutely aware of the eyes that tracked their passage. Women pausing in their work, children stopping their games to stare, warriors conferring in low voices that carried judgment, even when the words were incomprehensible. The North Platte moved steady and clear at this point, its banks lined with cottonwoods whose leaves had begun their autumn transformation. Gold and yellow against the endless blue sky, Thashichamna stood at the water's edge, his posture relaxed but alert in the way of men accustomed to danger. Even in moments of peace, he turned as they approached, and Caroline was struck again by his sheer physical presence, the way he seemed to belong to this landscape in a way she never could, as if he had been shaped by the same forces that carved the mountains and cut the river channels. Renville spoke in Lakota, brief words that Thashichamna acknowledged with a slight nod. Then the war chief gestured for Caroline to sit on a flat rock near the water. He took a position nearby, close enough for conversation, but maintaining a respectful distance. "I will translate," Renville said, settling himself between them, "but I will translate exactly. Not soften or change, you both deserve truth." Thashichamna began speaking, his voice measured and deliberate, pausing frequently to allow Renville time to render his words into English. "I asked you here because what I must say requires understanding, not just hearing," the interpreter began. "Among my people, marriage is not what the white world makes it. It is not ownership, not chains that cannot be broken." Caroline listened intently, committing every word to memory. "In Lakota, marriage is a partnership of choice that continues only as long as both choose it." Renville continued translating. If you come to my lodge and find you cannot live this way, you may leave. I will not stop you. I will give you a horse and supplies to return to the fort. But if you stay, I ask that you stay with full heart, not partial, not held back. The honesty of it surprised Caroline. She had expected demands, requirements, perhaps even threats disguised as requests. Instead, she was being offered genuine choice. Even after she had traveled so far, Tashichamna continued, and Renville's translation flowed. I need a wife who can read the treaties, who can tell me what the agents promise in their language, who can help my people understand what is being taken from them in words they do not yet know. But more than this, I need someone who will not betray us, who will not use this knowledge to serve her own people against mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. How can you trust me? Caroline asked, interrupting. How can you know I won't do exactly that? Tashichamna waited for the translation, then responded, his eyes never leaving her face. I cannot know, Renville translated. Trust is always a risk. But I watched you yesterday when you spoke to my sister. You did not try to make yourself appear better than you are. You did not hide your desperation or dress it in noble purpose. He paused as Tashichamna continued. People who lie about small things will lie about large things. People who speak hard truths about themselves can be trusted with hard truths about others. The logic was simple but profound. Caroline felt the weight of it, the responsibility being placed in her hands. There is more you should know, Renville continued translating. My first wife, Maka Washte, was beloved by our people. She was skilled in all the women's arts. She sang the old songs, she knew the medicine plants. Her death wounded more than just me, it wounded the whole band. Some will see you as trying to replace her, and they will resent it. I'm not trying to replace anyone. Caroline said quietly, I'm just trying to survive. When this was translated, something shifted in Tashichamna's expression, a softening that suggested her words had reached him in ways more eloquent phrases might not have. He spoke again, longer this time, his hands moving to emphasize certain points. If you agree to this marriage, you will live in my lodge. You will learn our ways, our language, our customs. Renville translated, Wichachala will teach you what you need to know. She is harsh, but she is the best teacher. If you can earn her respect, others will follow. My people are facing a time of great change. The buffalo grow fewer each year. The white soldiers push into lands promised to us by treaty. We are being forced to choose between our way of life and survival itself. Tashichamna's voice carried pain now, even through translation. I need a wife who understands both worlds, who can help us navigate what is coming. But I will not ask you to betray your own people, only to be honest about what you see, what you hear, what you believe the government intends, and if there is conflict, Caroline asked. If I must choose between your people and mine, then you choose. Renville translated Tashichamna's response. I will not force your hand, but know this, if you carry my name, my people will see you as Lakota. White society will see you as betrayer. You will belong fully to neither world. The stark reality of it settled over Caroline like a heavy blanket. She thought of Philadelphia, of church socials and tea parties, of the rigid structure of society that had ultimately rejected her anyway. Then she thought of Henry Wolfe's hands on her shoulders, his assumption that her body was payment for his dead brother's debts, the law that would have upheld his claim. What do you want from me? She asked directly, beyond the practical matters. What do you want from a wife? Tashichamna spoke at length, and Renville translated carefully. I want a partner who will speak her mind, who will not hide her thoughts to keep peace. I have seen what happens in marriages where one person swallows their words. Resentment grows like poison. I want someone who will work beside me, not behind me, who will help make decisions about our life together. If children come, I want them raised to know both worlds, to understand the white man's ways without forgetting they are Lakota. He paused, then added something that made Renville hesitate before translating. He says he wants someone who will not fear him, who will see him as a man, not as a savage, not as something exotic or dangerous, just as a man trying to do right by his people and build a life worth living. Caroline felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. The vulnerability in those words, delivered through a translator beside a river in a land so far from everything she had known, touched something deep within her. "I was married before," she said slowly, "to a man who saw me as property, as something he owned that could be used or neglected as he saw fit. He was not cruel in obvious ways, he did not beat me, but he never asked what I thought, what I wanted, what I dreamed." She met Thashichemna's gaze directly. "I do not want that again. I will not be silent decoration in any man's lodge." When Renville translated, Thashichemna's expression showed approval. He responded immediately, forcefully. "Good," Renville translated. "I do not want a woman who will be silent. I want a woman with fire, with opinions, with the courage to tell me when I am wrong. My mother was such a woman. She was my father's closest advisor. The band respected her counsel. That is the kind of partnership I seek." They talked for hours as the sun climbed higher, Renville translating back and forth, covering practical matters and deeper questions. Thashichemna explained the structure of Lakota society, the importance of generosity, the complex web of kinship obligations, the role of women in decision-making that white society never acknowledged. Caroline asked about daily life, about expectations, about how she would be received. She learned that as a war chief's wife, she would be expected to feed any who came hungry to their lodge, that she would need to process hides and make clothing, that she would be responsible for maintaining their home and helping with communal work. But she also learned that Lakota women owned their lodges, that they could divorce easily, that they had a voice in tribal decisions, that their work was valued as essential rather than dismissed as merely domestic. As the sun reached its zenith, Thashichemna asked the question that had been circling unspoken between them. "Bichanrilmwa, will you carry my name? Will you become my wife in truth? Not just in paper signed by missionaries and agents." Caroline looked at the river, at the cottonwoods, at the vast sky that seemed to stretch forever. She thought about the life she was leaving, the life she was being offered. The terrifying freedom of choosing her own path, even when all paths led into unknown territory. "Yes," she said finally, "I will carry your name. I will try to be the partner you describe. I cannot promise I will succeed. I cannot promise I won't make mistakes, but I promise I will try with everything I have." Thashichemna listened to the translation, then stood, extending his hand to help Caroline to her feet. His grip was warm, calloused, strong, without being crushing. He spoke again, and Renville translated with something like emotion in his voice. "Then we will marry in the Lakota way, with ceremony that honors both your courage in coming here and my people's traditions. We will marry tomorrow when the sun rises, and you will come to my lodge as my wife." Caroline felt her heart race. Tomorrow seemed impossibly soon, and yet she had already waited so long for her life to truly begin. "There is one more thing," Thashichemna said through Renville. "You must choose a Lakota name. You cannot be called only by your white name if you are to live among us. The name should reflect something true about you," Caroline considered, thinking about the journey that had brought her here, about the grief and loss that had carved her into something new. "What is the Lakota word for standing?" she asked, "or remaining, or surviving?" Renville thought for a moment. "There are several words, but perhaps nudging. It means standing, enduring, continuing to stand. Wichaglegapi nudging," Thashichemna said suddenly, his voice carrying approval. When Renville looked at him questioningly, he elaborated in Lakota. He suggests Wichaglegapi nudging, which means roughly standing after return, or she who stands after coming back. Renville explained, "It honors your journey here, your return from the darkness of grief, your choice to stand and build anew." The name settled over Caroline like a blessing. It was not pretty in the way white names tried to be, but it was true. It spoke to who she had become rather than who she had been born to be. Wichaglegapi nudging. she repeated slowly, trying to shape her mouth around the unfamiliar sounds. Yes, I will carry that name. Tashichamna smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the harsh lines, revealing warmth beneath the warrior's exterior. He spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing toward the camp. Come, Renville translated, there is much to prepare. Wichachala will help you understand what tomorrow's ceremony requires, and tonight there will be a feast. The band will want to see who carries such a name. As they walked back toward the camp, Caroline felt the weight of decision settling into certainty. She was doing this, she was truly doing this, marrying a Lakota war chief, taking a name in a language she barely understood, stepping into a life that would require her to become someone entirely new. Terror and exhilaration warred within her chest, but beneath both was something solid, something that felt almost like belonging. When they reached Wichachala's lodge, Tashichamna spoke to his sister in rapid Lakota. The older woman's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, skepticism, then grudging acceptance. She looked at Caroline with new assessment, as if seeing her for the first time as a person rather than an intrusion. Wichachala spoke, her tone formal, and Renville translated. She says, if you are to marry her brother, you must be properly prepared. You cannot stand before the people in that black dress. It speaks of death and mourning. A wedding should speak of life. I have no other dress suitable for ceremony, Caroline admitted. Wichachala said something sharp, almost impatient, then disappeared into the lodge. She emerged moments later with a dress of pale deerskin, decorated with blue and white beadwork in geometric patterns. Clearly made with great skill and care, this was Makawashte's wedding dress. Renville translated Wichachala's words, his voice quiet with the significance. She says you may wear it not to replace her sister-in-law, but to honor the tradition of new beginnings. Caroline felt tears threaten again. The generosity of the offer, from a woman who had been so hostile just yesterday, struck her deeply. I would be honored, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I will treat it with the respect it deserves. Wichachala nodded once, then gestured for Caroline to enter the lodge. As Renville prepared to leave, Caroline caught his arm. Thank you, she said, for translating truly, for not hiding the difficult parts. The interpreter smiled. You will do well here, Mrs. Wolf. Or should I say, Witch Hagligapi Najing, you have the heart for this life, even if you don't yet know it. After he left, Caroline stood in the lodge with Wichachala. The wedding dress spread between them, like a bridge across impossible distance. The older woman began to speak, slowly, clearly, pointing to objects and saying their Lakota names. This would be Caroline's first true lesson in the language, in the culture, in the life she had chosen. She listened intently, repeating each word, stumbling over pronunciations, trying desperately to commit everything to memory. Outside, the camp continued its daily rhythm, but inside the lodge, two women from different worlds worked to build understanding one word. One gesture, one moment at a time. Tomorrow, Caroline Wolf would become Wichagligapi Najing, would marry Tashichamna in a ceremony she did not fully understand, would step fully into a life that promised nothing but the chance to stand, to endure, to build something new from the ashes of what had been. And as the afternoon light slanted through the lodge opening, painting everything in shades of gold, Caroline felt something she had not felt in years. She felt ready. The wedding day arrived with a sky so clear it hurt to look at. The kind of blue that existed only in places where civilization had not yet clouded the air with its ambitions. Caroline woke before dawn, her stomach twisted with nerves that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the enormity of what she was about to do. Wichachala was already moving about the lodge with purpose, heating water in a buffalo paunch suspended over the fire, preparing herbs that filled the air with unfamiliar but not unpleasant scents. She gestured for Caroline to rise, speaking in Lakota with a tone that suggested instruction rather than conversation. Over the past day, Caroline had learned perhaps 24 Lakota words, enough to understand basic directions, but nowhere near enough for actual communication. Still, Wichachala's intentions were clear through gesture and tone. Caroline was to wash, to prepare herself, to transform from the widow in black to something new. The washing was thorough and ritualistic, Wichachala adding the herbs to the warm water, creating a mixture that smelled of sage and sweetgrass. She indicated that Caroline should wash her hair, her face, her hands, each gesture deliberate and meaningful. This was not simply cleanliness but purification, a symbolic shedding of what had been to make room for what would be. As Caroline washed, she thought about Thomas, about the girl she had been when she married him at 17, desperate to escape her father's failing household, willing to tie herself to a man she barely knew because it seemed like the only option. That marriage had been about survival too, but it had been survival through surrender. Through making herself smaller, quieter, less, this felt different. This felt like survival through expansion, through becoming more rather than less, through claiming space rather than shrinking from it. When the washing was complete, Wichachala brought out the wedding dress, handling it with reverence that spoke of deep love for the woman who had worn it before. The deerskin was soft as silk, worked until it felt like fabric rather than leather. The beadwork intricate beyond anything Caroline had seen in Philadelphia's finest shops. Wichachala helped her into the dress, adjusting it carefully. The fit was not perfect but close enough. Makawashte had been slightly taller but similarly built. The older woman's hands were gentle as she worked, occasionally speaking in Lakota, words Caroline could not understand, but whose tone carried approval. The dress transformed her. Caroline caught her reflection in the polished metal and barely recognized herself. The pale deerskin brought out the color in her cheeks. The blue and white beadwork drew the eye to patterns that told stories she was only beginning to learn. Her dark hair, braided in the Lakota style, completed the transformation. Wichachala stepped back, studying her work with critical eyes, then nodded once, sharply. She spoke a single word in Lakota that Caroline had learned the day before. Waste good. Outside, the camp had awakened to the importance of the day. Caroline could hear increased activity, voices calling back and forth, the sounds of preparation. A war chief's wedding was a communal affair, not a private ceremony. The whole band would witness and either accept or reject this union. Renville arrived as the sun cleared the horizon, his expression serious but not unkind. He carried with him several items, small gifts that Tashichamna had sent. A comb made of bone, decorated with careful carvings, a necklace of blue and white beads that matched the dress, a pair of moccasins worked with porcupine quills in delicate patterns. "He says these belong to his mother," Renville explained quietly. "She was greatly respected among the people. To offer them to you is to say he sees you as worthy of that same respect." Caroline's hands trembled as she accepted the gifts. The weight of tradition, of expectation, of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. "Tell him I am honored," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell him I will try to be worthy of such trust." When Wichachala placed the necklace around Caroline's neck and helped her into the moccasins, the transformation was complete. Caroline Wolfe, the widow from Philadelphia, had disappeared. In her place stood Wichaglagapi Najing, about to marry a Lakota war chief in a ceremony that would bind her to a people and a way of life she was only beginning to understand. The ceremony would take place in the center of the camp, where a space had been cleared and a ceremonial fire built. As Caroline emerged from the lodge, she felt every eye in the camp turn toward her. Women paused in their work, children stopped their play, warriors who had been tending horses turned to watch. The silence was heavy, weighted with judgment and curiosity in equal measure. Caroline held her head high, remembering her mother's lessons about dignity, but also remembering Tashichamna's words about partnership, about standing with full heart rather than held back. Wichachala walked beside her, and Caroline realized with sudden gratitude that this was a statement of support. The war chief's sister, who had been so hostile just days before, was publicly walking her to the ceremony, lending her own considerable status to this moment. Thashichamna stood waiting near the fire, and Caroline's breath caught at the sight of him. He wore traditional regalia that transformed him from impressive to magnificent. A shirt of white deerskin decorated with elaborate quillwork and hairpipe bones, leggings with beaded designs that ran their full length, a ceremonial headdress with eagle feathers that spoke of honors earned in battle. But it was his face that held her attention. The fierce pride there, the certainty, the complete lack of shame or doubt. He was claiming her before his people without reservation, offering her a place beside him without apology. An elder stood near the fire, a man whose age had bent his back, but not dimmed the intelligence in his eyes. This was Wichasha Wakang, the holy man who would conduct the ceremony. Renville had explained his role the day before. The holy man began to speak, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd with surprising strength. Renville translated quietly for Caroline, standing close enough that she could hear, but not so close as to intrude on the ceremony itself. He speaks of the sacred nature of marriage, of how it is a partnership between equals, of how the woman brings the lodge and the man brings his strength, and together they create something greater than either could alone. He speaks of how marriage between peoples, between worlds, requires even greater courage, greater commitment, greater willingness to see beyond what is familiar. The holy man called Thashichamna forward, asking him questions in Lakota, receiving responses that seemed to satisfy. Then he called Caroline forward, and she moved to stand beside the war chief. Acutely aware of how small she seemed next to him, how pale her skin looked against his, how foreign she must appear to everyone watching. Through Renville, the holy man asked her questions. Did she come willingly without coercion? Did she understand that marriage among the Lakota was sacred but not eternal, that it lasted only as long as both partners chose? Did she promise to honor the Lakota ways, to learn their language, to respect their customs? Did she understand that any children born of this union would be Lakota, raised in the ways of the people? To each question, Caroline answered clearly, her voice steady, despite the fear that threatened to choke her. Yes, she came willingly. Yes, she understood the nature of Lakota marriage. Yes, she would honor their ways. Yes, she understood about children. The holy man produced a buffalo robe, holding it so that both Thashichamna and Caroline could place their hands upon it. He spoke at length, his words flowing over them like water, blessing them, asking the spirits to guide them, requesting that the buffalo provide for them, that the eagle grant them vision, that the earth hold them steady. Then he wrapped the robe around both of them, binding them together in its folds. Caroline found herself pressed against Thashichamna's side, feeling the warmth of him, the solid strength, the steady beat of his heart. For a moment, wrapped together in the buffalo robe before the assembled people, she felt a strange sense of rightness, as if this impossible choice had somehow been exactly what she needed. When the holy man released the robe, Thashichamna took Caroline's hand. His grip was warm, certain, claiming her before his people without hesitation. He spoke in Lakota, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathering. Renville translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says this woman has traveled far, has left everything familiar, has chosen to stand with the Lakota in a time of great change. He says she carries his name now, Wichaglagapi Najing, and any who disrespect her disrespect him. He says she will be his partner, his advisor, his wife in all ways. He asks his people to welcome her, to teach her, to give her the chance to prove herself through her actions. The silence that followed was profound, stretching so long that Caroline felt panic begin to rise. Then someone began to ululate. The high-pitched, wavering cry that Caroline had learned signified approval, celebration, joy. Another voice joined, then another, until the sound surrounded them, embraced them, welcomed them. Not everyone joined the celebration. Caroline saw warriors who remained silent, women whose faces showed disapproval, but enough voices rose that the message was clear. The band would accept this marriage, would give her a chance, however grudging. Tashichamna led her to his lodge, which had been prepared for this day. Unlike Wichachala's lodge where Caroline had stayed, this one was clearly the home of a respected leader. It was larger, the hides newer, the interior arranged with both practicality and beauty. Inside, gifts from the band had been left, parfleches filled with pemmican and dried berries, soft robes for sleeping, cooking implements, all the things a new household would need. The generosity surprised Caroline, touched her in ways she had not expected. "This is your home now," Tashichamna said in his careful English, his accent making the words sound both familiar and strange. "You are mistress here. You will arrange things as you see fit. You will make this space ours, not just mine." The trust implicit in those words nearly undid her. He was not simply tolerating her presence, but actively inviting her to claim space, to make decisions, to be a true partner. A feast had been prepared, and the celebration would continue through the day and into the night. But first, Tashichamna and Caroline sat together in their lodge, and he began to teach her more Lakota words. Lodge, fire, water, food, the basic vocabulary of daily life. He was patient when she stumbled, encouraging when she succeeded, treating her mistakes as learning rather than failure. They were interrupted by visitors bringing gifts, offering congratulations, assessing this new addition to their band. Wichachala came with several other women, including an elder named Wingyang Washte, who studied Caroline with sharp eyes before speaking at length in Lakota. "She says you have brave eyes but soft hands." Renville translated when he arrived to help with communication. "She says she will teach you to process hides, to make proper clothing, to prepare food in the Lakota way. She says your willingness to learn will determine whether you truly belong here." "I'm willing to learn," Caroline said directly to the old woman. "Whatever you will teach me, I will learn." When this was translated, Wingyang Washte's stern expression softened slightly. She nodded once, then handed Caroline a scraping tool made of bone, smooth from years of use. She spoke again briefly. "She says this was her daughter's tool," Renville translated quietly. "Her daughter died of the white man's spotted sickness 5 winters ago. She says, if you honor the tool by using it well, by learning the skills it represents, then perhaps some good can come from the meeting of our peoples." Caroline accepted the tool with both hands, understanding the profound nature of the gift, the trust being offered despite loss, despite grief, despite every reason to reject her. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will honor this gift with everything I have." The feast that followed was unlike anything Caroline had experienced. Long strips of buffalo meat roasted over fires, wild turnips and berries prepared in ways that brought out flavors she had never imagined, soups thick with marrow and herbs. The food was rich, sometimes gamey, utterly different from Philadelphia cuisine, but deeply satisfying. People ate with their hands or with carved wooden spoons, sharing bowls, offering choice pieces to honored guests. Caroline watched and learned, mimicking the gestures of respect, the ways of showing gratitude without words she did not yet possess. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. As darkness fell, drums began, their rhythm primal and compelling. Men danced, their movements telling stories of hunts and battles, of bravery and sacrifice. Women joined in different dances, their steps speaking of gathering and planting, of life and continuity. Caroline watched, mesmerized by the beauty of it, by the way movement and rhythm and firelight combined to create something that transcended language. Tashichamna leaned close, speaking quietly. "These dances tell our history," he said. "They teach our children who we are, where we come from, what we value. You must learn these dances too, must understand the stories they tell." "Will you teach me?" Caroline asked. "I will," he promised, "and others will as well. But you must be patient with yourself. These things take time to learn, to truly understand." As the night deepened, the newly married couple finally retreated to their lodge. The sounds of celebration continued outside, but within the buffalo hide walls, a different kind of beginning unfolded. Thashichamna moved slowly, carefully, reading Caroline's nervousness with the same attention he had shown in every interaction. He did not rush, did not demand, but waited, giving her time to adjust to this new reality. "I was married before," Caroline said quietly, her hands twisting in her lap, "but I was never truly seen, never truly known. Then we begin differently," Thashichamna said, sitting across from her, making no move to close the distance between them. "We begin with truth, with choice, with respect. If you are not ready, we wait. If you need time, we take time. This marriage is for building a life, not for one night." The kindness in his words, the patience, undid something tight in Caroline's chest. She had expected possession, assumption of rights, the taking that had characterized her first marriage. Instead, she was being offered partnership. "Agency, choice. I'm ready," she said softly. "Not because I have to be, but because I choose to be." He moved to her then, and his touch was gentle, exploratory, asking permission with each new intimacy. Caroline found herself responding, not with the resigned acceptance that had marked her first marriage bed, but with genuine curiosity, with growing desire, with the beginning of something that might in time become love, later. As they lay together under soft buffalo robes, Caroline stared up at the smoke hole where stars were visible. Thashichamna's breathing had deepened into sleep, his arm heavy and warm across her waist. She felt the solid reality of him, this stranger who was now her husband, this warrior who had treated her with more respect than any so-called civilized man ever had. Outside, the celebration continued, drums beating steady as a heartbeat, voices rising in songs she did not yet understand, but which stirred something deep within her. This was her wedding night, but it was also something more. It was the night she truly chose her own path, the night she stopped running from one life and started building another. Caroline Wolfe had died somewhere on the journey west, and Wichagligapinajing had been born in her place. This new woman, this bridge between worlds, would face challenges she could not yet imagine, would be tested in ways she could not anticipate. But tonight, wrapped in buffalo robes in a Lakota lodge, listening to drums and feeling her husband's heartbeat against her back, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt home. The first snow came 6 weeks after the wedding, early even by Wyoming standards, arriving in the night with silence that transformed the world by morning. Caroline woke to a strange, muffled quality in the air, the usual camp sounds dampened by the white blanket that covered everything. Thashichamna was already awake, adding wood to the fire with movements so practiced they made no sound. He glanced at her and smiled, a gesture that had become more frequent as the weeks passed, as they learned each other's rhythms and patterns. "First snow," he said in English, then repeated it in Lakota, teaching her as he did with everything. "Wanietu tokaheya." Winter announces itself, we must prepare. Caroline rose, wrapping a buffalo robe around her shoulders against the morning chill. Through the lodge opening, she could see the camp covered in white, smoke rising from fires into a sky heavy with the promise of more snow. In 6 weeks, this view had become as familiar as Philadelphia's streets once were, but infinitely more beautiful. The past weeks had been the most challenging of Caroline's life, and yet also strangely fulfilling. Each day brought new lessons, new skills to master, new words to learn. Bingyang Washte had proven a demanding but effective teacher, showing Caroline how to scrape hides until her shoulders ached, how to soften leather by working it with stones and brains, how to cut and sew garments that would withstand frontier winters. Her hands, once soft and pale, had become rough and capable. Blisters had formed and broken and formed again until calluses replaced them. She had learned to move differently, to carry weight balanced on her back the way Lakota women did, to work from dawn until dark without complaint. But she had also learned joy in these tasks, the satisfaction of transforming a raw hide into something useful and beautiful, the pride of preparing food that Thashichamna praised, the growing confidence that came from mastering skills that had seemed impossible at first. Her Lakota had improved dramatically, driven by necessity and immersion. She could now conduct basic conversations, understand most of what was said around her, though the deeper meanings and subtle jokes still escaped her. Children had become her unexpected allies, patient with her mistakes, delighted when she learned new words, teaching her through play what adults taught through work, which Achila had thawed considerably, though she remained stern and demanding. Just yesterday, she had nodded in approval when Caroline completed a particularly difficult beading pattern, then immediately set her to work on something more complex. It was Achala's way, never satisfied, always pushing. But Caroline had learned to read the approval beneath the criticism. "Come," Thashichamna said. Pulling her from her thoughts, we check the horses, make sure they have shelter from the wind. Then we help the elders prepare for heavy winter. This too Caroline had learned, the communal nature of Lakota life, how everyone contributed according to their abilities, how the strong helped the weak, how no one went hungry if anyone had food. It was so different from Philadelphia's rigid class structures, from the way poverty was seen as personal failure rather than communal responsibility. They worked through the morning, ensuring horses were protected, helping to secure lodge coverings against the wind, carrying firewood to those who needed it. Caroline's muscles, strengthened by weeks of labor, no longer screamed in protest at such work. She had become stronger, harder, more capable than she ever imagined possible. By midday, the snow had stopped, leaving the world crystalline and impossibly beautiful. Caroline stood for a moment, simply breathing in the cold, clean air, watching children slide down a slope on pieces of bark, their laughter bright against the white landscape. A group of women called to her, gesturing for her to join them. They were heading to gather deadfall wood from the forest before the next storm hit, a task that required many hands. Caroline grabbed a leather strap for bundling wood and joined them, understanding their Lakota well enough now to follow the conversation. They spoke of the coming winter, of which families had prepared well and which might struggle, of a young woman in a neighboring band who was expecting her first child, of the agents at the fort who kept changing the terms of the treaty, making promises they had no intention of keeping. One woman, Thashingaluta, whose name meant red blanket, spoke directly to Caroline. "Your husband seeks to protect our people from these broken promises," she said in Lakota, spoken slowly for Caroline's benefit. "He believes you can help us understand the white man's words. The tricks hidden in treaties we sign." "I will try," Caroline responded in Lakota. Though her accent still marked her as foreign, I read the agent's papers. I see where meanings change between speaking and writing, where promises become something else on paper. "Can you be trusted?" another woman asked bluntly. "When the time comes to choose, will you stand with us or with your own people?" The question hung in the cold air, direct and challenging. Caroline met the woman's eyes steadily. "My people cast me aside when I was no longer useful to them," she said carefully, choosing her Lakota words with precision. "Your people gave me a home when I had none, taught me when I was ignorant, fed me when I was hungry. Where I stand should be clear. Words are easy," the woman said, but she said it without hostility, merely stating fact. "Actions are what matter." Yes, Caroline agreed, actions are what matter. They worked in companionable silence after that, gathering wood, bundling it, carrying it back to camp. The physical labor that had once exhausted Caroline now felt almost meditative, a rhythm that allowed her mind to wander while her body performed its tasks. That evening, as Caroline prepared their meal, roasting meat and boiling wild turnips in the way Wingyang Washte had taught her, Thashichamna returned from a council meeting. His expression was troubled, the easy warmth of the morning replaced by tension. "The agent sent word," he said, sitting heavily on a backrest. "He wants all chiefs to come to the fort in 3 days, says the government has new terms for the treaty, new boundaries they wish to discuss." Caroline's hands stilled over her work. "New terms or new restrictions?" "Always restrictions," Thashichamna said bitterly. "More land they want, more promises they will break." He looked at her intently. "This is why I needed a wife who reads their language, who understands how they hide truth in paper words. You will come with me to this meeting. You will read what they write and tell me what they truly mean." The weight of responsibility settled over Caroline like a physical thing. This was the moment she had known would come, when her skills would be tested, when her loyalties would be examined, not in abstract but in concrete reality. "I will read carefully," she promised. "I will tell you exactly what the papers say, not what the agents claim they say." Over the next 2 days, the camp buzzed with tension and preparation. The bands began arriving, their lodges going up near Thashichamna's, war chiefs and elders gathering to discuss strategy before facing the Indian agent. Caroline listened to these discussions, her improving Lakota allowing her to follow most of what was said. The picture that emerged was grim. The government wanted more land, wanted to confine the Lakota to smaller territories, wanted to stop their seasonal movements that had sustained them for generations. In exchange, they promised supplies that never came, money that disappeared before reaching the people, protection from white settlers who were themselves the greatest threat. One evening, an elder named Tathanka Yotake, whose name meant Sitting Bull, arrived from another band. He was younger than Caroline expected, perhaps 40, but his presence commanded immediate respect. He spoke at length, his words painting a picture of systematic betrayal, of treaties signed and immediately violated, of a way of life being destroyed by people who saw the land only as something to be owned and exploited. Caroline sat at the edge of the gathering. Thashichamna, having told her she should hear these words, should understand what was truly at stake. Renville was there, translating quietly when Caroline's Lakota failed to capture the full meaning. Sitting Bull turned his attention to her, addressing her directly in Lakota. "You are the white woman who married Thashichamna," he said, "you who carries the name Witch Haglegapi Najing." "Yes," Caroline replied, feeling dozens of eyes upon her. "Can you truly stand with us?" "Knowing what it will cost?" Sitting Bull asked. "Your people will call you traitor, will say you betrayed your race, will never welcome you back among them. And we," his gesture encompassed the gathered leaders, "we will always wonder if your first loyalty is to the skin you were born in, rather than the people you chose." The challenge was clear, honest, demanding. Caroline took a breath, gathering her thoughts, then responded in Lakota, speaking slowly to ensure her meaning was clear. "I cannot change the skin I was born in any more than you can," she said. "But I can choose who I stand with, who I build my life beside. The people who share my skin abandoned me when I needed them most, showed me that their laws and their civilization were built to protect the powerful and discard the weak." She paused, making eye contact with Sitting Bull. "Since coming here, I have been taught, been fed, been welcomed into your ways despite every reason to reject me. My husband treats me with more respect than any white man ever did. Your women teach me skills my own mother never knew. Your children smile at me without judgment. Where would you have me stand?" "Actions will prove your words," Sitting Bull said, but there was approval in his tone. "We will see how you read the white man's papers, whether you tell us comfortable lies or difficult truths." The day of the meeting arrived with bitter cold, the kind that made breath crystallize and turned exposed skin numb within minutes. A group of 20 warriors and chiefs prepared to ride to Fort Laramie, Thashichamna among them, and Caroline would accompany them as the only one who could read and write English with true fluency. She dressed carefully in the warmest clothing she owned, leggings and a dress of heavy deer hide, a buffalo robe wrapped tight, moccasins lined with fur. Wichachala helped her braid her hair, weaving in strips of red cloth that signified she was a married woman of status. "You carry much today," Wichachala said in Lakota, speaking more gently than usual. "Not just words on paper, but the trust of our people. Do not let fear of your old world make you betray your new one." "I won't," Caroline promised. The ride to Fort Laramie took most of the day, the group traveling in silence, each man wrapped in his own thoughts. Caroline rode beside Thashichamna, aware that her presence was unusual, that Lakota women did not typically attend such meetings, but that her skills made her presence necessary. The fort looked different now. No longer the gateway to a new life, but a symbol of the world she had left behind. Soldiers watched their approach with hands near weapons, suspicious of any gathering of Lakota warriors. Caroline saw them notice her, saw the confusion and then disgust that crossed their faces when they realized a white woman rode with the Indians. Dressed in their clothing, clearly one of them now, the meeting was held in a large wooden building, cold despite a stove burning in the corner. The Indian agent, a man named Morrison with a florid face and calculating eyes, greeted them with false warmth. Several soldiers stood along the walls, ostensibly for protection, but clearly present as intimidation. Morrison's gaze lingered on Caroline, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to contempt. "Mrs. Wolfe," he said, his tone making her former name sound like an accusation. "I see you've gone quite native." "My name is Witch Haglegapi Najing," Caroline said clearly, "and I'm here as translator for my husband." Morrison's laugh was ugly. "Translator, is that what they call it? How far the decent have fallen." Tashichamna spoke sharply in Lakota, and though Caroline did not translate his words, their meaning was clear in his tone. Morrison's smirk faded, replaced by wariness. The agent laid out papers on a rough table, maps showing boundaries and territories. He began his presentation, speaking in the simplified English he clearly thought appropriate for Indians, explaining how the government wanted to adjust the treaty boundaries, how this would be better for everyone, how the Lakota would receive increased supplies in exchange for a small parcel of land. Caroline listened carefully, watching as Morrison pointed to maps, as he made promises and assurances. Then she asked to see the actual treaty document. "The legal language that would be binding, that's just formality," Morrison said dismissively. "What I've told you is what matters. The paper is what matters," Caroline said firmly, in English, so there could be no misunderstanding. "The paper is what will be enforced, what will be used to justify future actions. I need to see the actual language." Morrison's eyes narrowed, clearly reassessing her. He reluctantly pushed the document across the table. Caroline read it carefully. Her years of helping her father with his failing bakeries accounts, of understanding contracts and legal language, serving her now. What she found made her blood run cold. The verbal presentation had spoken of adjusting boundaries, of a small parcel of land, of increased supplies. The written document told a very different story. It ceded vast territories. It promised supplies only if certain impossible conditions were met. It included provisions that would effectively end the Lakota's ability to hunt buffalo, to move seasonally, to live as they always had. She read it twice, making sure she understood correctly, then looked up at Morrison. His expression confirmed what she had found. He knew exactly what the document said, knew it bore little resemblance to his verbal promises. Caroline turned to Tashichamna and began speaking in Lakota, translating not Morrison's words, but the actual content of the treaty. The room grew colder as she spoke, as the chiefs realized the extent of the deception. "The paper says you give up all land north of the White River," she said clearly. "It says supplies come only if you move to the agency within 6 moons. It says you cannot leave the boundaries without permission. It says hunting is restricted to designated areas where there are no buffalo." Morrison stood abruptly. "Now wait just a minute, that's not what I said, but it is what the paper says," Caroline said, meeting his eyes. "And the paper is what matters. Isn't that what you told me when my husband's debts came due? That what was written was all that mattered? That verbal promises meant nothing?" The agent's face flushed dark red. "You would believe savages over your own people? I believe what is written in black and white," Caroline said. "I believe evidence over promises. I believe reality over comfortable lies." The meeting dissolved into angry voices, Lakota chiefs demanding to know why the verbal and written terms differed so drastically, Morrison insisting there were misunderstandings, that Caroline had misread or mistranslated. But Caroline held firm, reading passage after passage in both English and Lakota, showing exactly where the deceptions lay. Finally, Morrison slammed his hand on the table. "This treaty stands regardless of what some squaw man's woman says," he shouted. "You will sign or face the consequences." "We will not sign," Tashichamna said in English, his words careful but clear. "We will not be lied to like children. We will not give up our land for promises you do not intend to keep." "Then you are in violation of previous treaties," Morrison said coldly, "and the army will respond accordingly." The ride back to camp was tense, everyone understanding that Caroline's translation had potentially started a war. But no one blamed her for the truth she had revealed. Several chiefs thanked her, Sitting Bull himself nodding in respect as they parted ways. That night, back in their lodge, Tashichamna held Caroline close. "You chose today," he said quietly. "You chose knowing what it would cost." "I chose honesty," Caroline replied. "I chose what was right. Even though it was hard, many would have lied, would have softened the words to avoid conflict, would have protected themselves." "I'm not many," Caroline said. "I am Wichaglagapi Najing. I stand with my people, and today my people needed truth." Outside, the winter wind began to howl, bringing with it the promise of storms, both natural and human-made. Caroline lay awake long into the night, knowing that her actions today had changed everything, had marked her irrevocably as enemy to the world she came from, and ally to the world she had chosen. But she did not regret it, could not regret it, because for the first time in her life, she had stood for something larger than her own survival. She had used her skills not for personal gain, but for justice, imperfect and incomplete as it might be. Tomorrow would bring consequences she could not predict, but tonight she had proven to herself and to others where she truly stood. Winter deepened with a vengeance after the failed treaty meeting, as if nature itself sought to punish the impasse between peoples. Snow fell in relentless waves, burying the land under white silence, transforming the world into something both beautiful and merciless. The Lakota bands scattered to their winter camps, seeking sheltered valleys where game might still be found, and the wind could not strip the warmth from bodies huddled around fires. Caroline's life contracted to the essential rhythms of survival. Wake before dawn to tend the fire, prepare food from dwindling supplies, work hides and mend clothing while daylight lasted, conserve energy and resources through the long frozen nights. She had thought herself hardened by the autumn's labor, but winter taught her new definitions of endurance. Yet even as the physical challenges mounted, Caroline found herself settling more deeply into this life, into the quiet intimacy of shared survival. Tashichamna proved himself not just a warrior, but a provider, hunting through storms that would have killed lesser men, always returning with meat to feed not just their lodge, but the elders who could no longer hunt for themselves. She learned the art of making nothing last forever, how to stretch pemmican and dried berries, how to boil bones until they yielded every trace of nourishment, how to make tools and thread and 100 other necessities from animals that gave their lives to sustain the people. Her hands, now permanently rough and scarred, moved with growing confidence through tasks that once seemed impossible. 3 months after the treaty meeting, word reached their winter camp that brought both joy and trepidation. Caroline's monthly courses, which had come with regularity since her marriage, had stopped. For 2 weeks she said nothing, fearing to hope, remembering the doctors in Philadelphia who had declared her likely barren, remembering Thomas's bitter disappointment month after month. But Gwinyang Washte noticed the old woman missed nothing. She watched Caroline one morning as she rushed outside to be sick, watched her return pale and shaking, then smiled with a knowing that needed no words. "You carry life," the elder said in Lakota, touching Caroline's still flat belly with gentle hands. "The spirits have blessed this union," terror and wonder warred in Caroline's chest. She thought of Maka Washte, who had died bringing Tashichamna's son into the world, thought of all the women she had known who had not survived childbirth, thought of the coming months and the vulnerability of the tiny life beginning within her. "I'm afraid," she admitted in Lakota. "Good. Wingyang Washde said pragmatically, "Fear keeps you careful, keeps you listening to your body. Only fools approach childbirth without fear." She patted Caroline's hand. "But you are strong now, stronger than you were. Your body knows how to work hard, how to endure. This will serve you when the time comes." That evening, Caroline told Tashichamna, watching his face carefully for reaction. For a long moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with a gentleness that belied his warrior's strength. "You give me hope," he said quietly in English, his voice thick with emotion. "Hope that something good can survive in these dark times, that life continues even when so much speaks of ending." "Are you not afraid?" Caroline asked, remembering his first wife and son. "Terrified," he admitted, but also grateful. "Also honored that you would risk this, would give this to me, to us." News of the pregnancy spread through the band with the speed that all important information traveled. Suddenly, Caroline found herself subject to increased scrutiny and care. Women she barely knew brought her special foods, soft robes, herbal teas, meant to strengthen both mother and child. Wichachala became almost protective, insisting Caroline avoid certain tasks. Rest more frequently, take better care. The attention was overwhelming at times. But Caroline understood it represented acceptance in a way nothing else had. A child, especially the child of a war chief, belonged to the entire band. By carrying this baby, Caroline had bound herself to these people in ways that transcended her white skin and foreign origins. As winter grudgingly released its grip and early spring began to show itself in subtle signs, runners arrived from Fort Laramie carrying messages that changed everything. The army, frustrated by the Lakota's refusal to sign the treaty, had begun a campaign of pressure and intimidation. Supplies promised under previous treaties were being withheld. Soldiers were harassing hunting parties. White settlers were being encouraged to push into treaty lands with promises of protection. A great council was called, all the bands gathering at a traditional meeting place along the Powder River. Tashichamna insisted Caroline come. Despite her pregnancy, despite the difficulty of travel, "Your voice matters," he said simply. "Your ability to read their words, to understand their deceptions, this is needed." The gathering was massive. Hundreds of lodges going up, thousands of Lakota coming together in a show of unity that sent a clear message to anyone watching. Caroline had never seen so many people in one place. The camp stretched for miles along the river, fires burning like stars across the landscape. The council itself was held in a huge lodge constructed specifically for the purpose, big enough to hold dozens of chiefs and elders. Caroline sat with the other translators and advisors, one of only 3 women present, her pregnant belly just beginning to show beneath her dress. The discussion ranged over days, voices rising and falling in passionate debate. Some chiefs advocated for compromise, for finding some way to coexist with the flood of white settlement that seemed unstoppable. Others argued for resistance, for defending their lands and their way of life, regardless of cost. Still others spoke of the practical realities, of dwindling buffalo herds, of children who went hungry, of a future that looked bleak, no matter which path they chose. Sitting Bull spoke at length, his words painting a vivid picture of systematic destruction, of how each treaty had taken more land, more freedom, more dignity. He argued that compromise with those who dealt in lies was itself a lie, that the only honorable path was resistance. But an elder named Thashunke Witko, whose name meant crazy horse, offered a different perspective. "We can resist," he said, "and we will likely die. Our children will die. Our way of life will die. Or we can adapt, can find ways to preserve what matters most, while changing what we must to survive. Neither path is good, but which serves our children better." The debate continued, exhausting and necessary, voices speaking truths that had no easy answers. Caroline listened and learned, understanding for the first time the full complexity of what her adopted people faced, the impossible choices that offered only degrees of loss rather than any real victory. On the third day, a runner arrived with news that silenced all debate. A wagon train of white settlers, ignoring treaty boundaries and army warnings, had been attacked by a small group of young warriors. Several settlers were dead, including women and children, and the army was using this as justification for a major military campaign against the Lakota. The council erupted in angry voices, some condemning the attack as foolish and counterproductive, others defending the warriors' right to protect their lands, all understanding that regardless of who was right, the consequences would fall on everyone. Tashichamna asked Caroline to draft a letter, to be sent to the territorial governor and to newspapers in the east. He dictated while she wrote, his words careful and deliberate. The letter explained the Lakota perspective, the years of broken treaties and unkept promises, the desperation that drove young men to violence, the desire of most chiefs for peaceful coexistence, if such a thing were truly possible. It asked for honest negotiation, for treaties that would be honored, for recognition that the Lakota were not savages, but people trying to preserve their homes and their way of life. When Caroline read back what she had written, translating it into Lakota so all could hear, the assembled chiefs nodded in approval. Several added their marks to the document, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse among them, but even as they made this gesture toward peace, everyone understood its likely futility. The pattern was well established. Incidents would be used to justify military action. Military action would lead to retaliation, and the cycle would continue until one side or the other was broken. The journey back to their band's camp was tense. Scouts reporting increased army patrols, settlers armed and hostile. The whole territory balanced on the edge of open warfare. Caroline felt her baby move for the first time during this journey, a flutter like butterfly wings against her insides, life asserting itself even as death seemed to gather on all horizons. They returned to find their camp already preparing for the worst. Lodges positioned for quick dismantling, horses kept close and ready, warriors checking weapons and preparing for battle. The women went about their work with grim determination, everyone understanding that the relative peace they had known was ending. One evening, as Caroline worked on tiny moccasins for her coming child, Vijhachala sat beside her. The older woman's hands moved over her own work, quill work of extraordinary intricacy, her fingers sure despite her age. When the fighting comes, Vijhachala said quietly in Lakota, you must not think of yourself. You must think only of the child, of survival, of whatever is necessary to protect the life you carry. Caroline's hands stilled over her work. What are you saying? I am saying that your white skin may be your child's salvation, Vijhachala said bluntly. If the soldiers come, if our warriors fall, if the choice is between death and returning to your people, you must choose life. I cannot abandon you. Abandon him, Caroline said, gesturing toward where Tashichamna sat with other warriors, planning defensive strategies. You may have no choice, Vijhachala said, her voice gentle but firm. War does not ask permission, does not care about our wishes. The strong protect the weak, the living honor the dead by surviving. This is the way it has always been. The conversation haunted Caroline through the following weeks as spring arrived in full, and with it, the dreaded military campaign. Columns of soldiers began moving through Lakota territory, burning abandoned camps, shooting horses, destroying food supplies, making it clear they intended not just to defeat the Lakota, but to break them entirely. Several times their band had to move quickly, dismantling camp and relocating to avoid army patrols. The constant movement was hard on everyone, but especially on Caroline, now visibly pregnant. Her body struggling with the physical demands, even as her mind reeled from the constant stress. In late May, the inevitable happened. Army scouts found their camp, and soldiers attacked at dawn. Caroline woke to gunfire and screaming, to Tashichamna already on his feet with rifle in hand, to chaos and terror that made thinking almost impossible. She helped the other women and children flee toward the river, her pregnant body awkward as she scrambled over rocks, the sound of battle behind them terrifying in its intensity. Bullets whined through the air. People fell, some to rise again, others to lie still. At the river, Wicachala organized the survivors with fierce efficiency, sending small groups in different directions to avoid presenting a single target. Caroline found herself pushed into a group of women and children, all fleeing north toward where another band was camped. She looked back desperately, trying to see Thashichamna among the warriors, making a stand to cover their family's escape, but smoke and distance made it impossible. All she could do was run, one hand pressed to her belly, as if she could protect the child through will alone. They ran for hours, stopping only when the sounds of battle had faded into memory, when exhaustion made further flight impossible. Of the 20 people in their group, 3 were wounded, one an elder who would not survive without medicine and rest. As night fell, they huddled together in a ravine, afraid to build a fire, afraid to make any sound that might draw attention. Children whimpered quietly. Mothers whispered comfort. Everyone listened for sounds of pursuit. Caroline's mind churned with terrible possibilities. Was Thashichamna alive or dead? Had their lodge with all their possessions been burned? How? Many had died, buying time for the rest to escape. What would become of them now, scattered and vulnerable in a hostile landscape? The baby moved inside her, strong kicks that felt like protest or perhaps determination, a reminder that regardless of what had happened, regardless of what was lost, life continued, demanded attention, required her to think beyond her own grief and fear. Over the next 3 days, they made their way cautiously north, living on roots and whatever small game they could catch without making noise, always moving, always alert, always afraid. They encountered other refugees, learned that several warriors had died in the attack, that Thashichamna was not among them, but was wounded, that the survivors were regrouping at a traditional stronghold in the mountains. The relief Caroline felt at knowing her husband lived was tempered by worry about his wounds, about what they would find when they finally reached safety, about how any of them would survive a summer hunted by an army determined to destroy them. When they finally reached the mountain stronghold, Caroline found a scene of desperation and defiance mixed together, dozens of lodges hastily erected, wounded being tended with limited supplies, warriors grimly preparing for continued resistance, women working. To create some semblance of normalcy for terrified children, she found Thashichamna in Wicachala's lodge. His shoulder bandaged where a bullet had torn through muscle, his face grey with pain and exhaustion, but alive, gloriously alive. Caroline fell to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak for the emotions that threatened to choke her. His good hand came up to cup her cheek. "You ran," he said, his voice weak but approving. "You protected our child. This is good. This is right." "I thought you might be dead," Caroline managed to say. "Nearly," he admitted, "but Wicachala is a skilled healer, and I am too stubborn to die before meeting my child." That night, lying beside her wounded husband in a makeshift camp, surrounded by desperate people, Caroline finally understood the full cost of the choice she had made. This was not a romantic adventure, not a simple escape from one bad situation to another better one. This was life and death, survival and destruction, love and loss, all mixed together in ways that allowed no simple answers. She had chosen to stand with these people, and that meant standing with them through the worst as well as the best. It meant risking everything, including the child she carried, for a cause that might already be lost. But even knowing this, even understanding the terrible price she might yet have to pay, Caroline found she could not regret her choice. These were her people now, this was her home, and she would stand with them until the bitter end, whatever that might be. Outside, guards kept watch through the night, and in the distance, the fires of the army camp glowed like a promise of destruction still to come. Summer arrived with heat that baked the mountain stronghold and tensions that threatened to break what remained of the scattered bands. Thashichamna's shoulder healed slowly. the wound clean but deep, leaving him weakened at a time when strength was most needed. Caroline, now 7 months pregnant, moved through each day with the dual focus of tending her husband and preparing for a birth that would come in the midst of chaos. The stronghold had become home to nearly 300 people, a mix of bands seeking safety in the mountains' remoteness. Food was scarce despite the hunters' best efforts. Game had been driven away by army patrols and the concentration of so many people in one area. The children's ribs began to show, the elders grew gaunt, and everyone understood they faced a choice. Between slow starvation and risking raids on supply lines, Caroline worked with the other women to stretch what little they had, boiling hides for broth when meat ran out, digging roots in areas already picked over, trying to keep the children fed even as her own body demanded more nourishment than was available. Her pregnancy had become obvious now. Her belly large and the baby active, kicking strongly, especially at night, when exhaustion made sleep almost impossible. Wingyangwashte watched over her with increasing concern. The elders experienced, seeing what Caroline tried to hide, that she was not eating enough, that her body was giving everything to the child and leaving nothing for itself, that she was weakening at the worst possible time. "You must eat more," the old woman insisted. In Lakota, bringing Caroline a bowl of precious broth that should have gone to the warriors. "The child takes what it needs from you. If you do not feed yourself, you will have nothing left when the birthing time comes." "Others need it more," Caroline protested weakly. "If you die in childbirth, what becomes of this child? What becomes of my nephew who fights to protect us while wounded? What becomes of the hope that life continues?" Wingyangwashte said sharply. "Drink the broth, survive. This is not selfishness but responsibility." The logic was irrefutable, and Caroline drank, though guilt sat heavy in her stomach alongside the meager nourishment. In late July, a runner arrived from Fort Laramie with a message that changed everything. The territorial governor, responding to pressure from eastern newspapers who had published Tashi Chamna's letter and to growing public discomfort with the army's scorched earth tactics, was offering new terms. If the bands would come to the fort for negotiations, if they would agree to a ceasefire, real talks about a sustainable treaty would begin. The council that followed was bitter and divisive, some chiefs arguing this was another trap, another false promise designed to lure them into vulnerability, others pointing out that with winter approaching and supplies nearly exhausted, they had little choice but to try. Sitting Bull argued against trusting any government promise, his voice passionate as he recounted years of betrayals. "We have heard such words before," he said. "Each time we believed, each time we were betrayed. How many times must we touch the fire before we learn it burns?" But Crazy Horse, pragmatic as always, asked the question no one wanted to face. "If we refuse, if we continue to resist, how many children will die this winter from cold and hunger? How many elders will we bury? How many warriors will fall to army bullets? At what point does continued resistance become simply slow death?" The debate raged for 2 days, while Caroline's body began sending signals she tried to ignore. Occasional tightening across her belly, a persistent ache in her lower back, a feeling of pressure that suggested the baby had dropped lower. She said nothing, unwilling to distract from discussions that would determine all their futures. Finally, it was decided that a delegation would go to Fort Laramie, including Tashi Chamna. Despite his still healing wound, Caroline would accompany them as translator, her pregnancy making some hope she would be treated gently, that soldiers might hesitate to fire on a party that included an obviously pregnant woman. The journey down from the mountains took 3 days, traveling slowly, to accommodate Caroline's condition and Tashi Chamna's injury. They camped each night with guards posted, everyone tense and watchful, expecting ambush at every turn. Caroline felt the baby shifting constantly, pressing against her ribs, making breathing difficult, reminding her that time was running short. Fort Laramie looked different than it had 10 months earlier when Caroline had first arrived. Now it was heavily fortified, soldiers everywhere, cannons positioned strategically, the whole place radiating military power and barely restrained hostility. When their delegation approached under a white flag, soldiers watched with hands on weapons, clearly itching for any excuse to open fire. The negotiations were held in the same building where Caroline had first exposed Agent Morrison's deceptions. But Morrison was no longer present. Rumors said he had been removed after his fraudulent treaty terms became public. In his place was a new agent named Richardson, younger and seemingly more honest, though Caroline reserved judgment. Also present was an army colonel named Thornton, a career officer whose weathered face and steady demeanor suggested competence. Rather than the bluster Caroline had come to expect from military men, most surprisingly, there was a lawyer from Washington, a thin man with spectacles named Hewitt, who had been sent specifically to ensure any new treaty was both fair and legal. The talks began with all sides laying out their positions. The Lakota wanted their traditional lands protected, wanted the right to hunt and move seasonally, wanted the army to stop destroying camps and killing horses, wanted the promises of previous treaties to actually be honored. The government representatives spoke of the reality of westward expansion, of settlers who would keep coming regardless of treaties, of limited resources and competing interests, of the need for the Lakota to accept that their old way of life was ending whether they liked it or not. It was brutal honesty rather than comfortable lies, and in some ways Caroline found it easier to work with. At least now the truth was being spoken plainly rather than hidden behind false promises. For 3 days they negotiated, Caroline translating everything carefully, ensuring both sides understood exactly what was being proposed. Her pregnancy made sitting for long periods uncomfortable. She had to stand frequently, pace when the baby kicked too forcefully. But she pushed through because this mattered too much to let physical discomfort interfere. On the 4th day, as they argued over specific boundary lines, Caroline felt something shift inside her, a sensation like tearing. Followed by a rush of warm fluid down her legs, she looked down in shock, seeing the puddle forming beneath her chair. Her water had broken. The baby was coming now, here, in the middle of these crucial negotiations. Thashichamna saw immediately, rising from his chair despite his wounded shoulder, calling for help in Lakota. The negotiations ground to a halt as everyone realized what was happening. Caroline felt the first real contraction hit, a band of iron tightening around her middle. Stealing her breath, "There's a doctor in the fort," Colonel Thornton said, standing quickly. "We can get her there in minutes." "No," Thashichamna said in his careful English. His arm around Caroline as another contraction made her gasp. "She births with our people, with our ways, not in your fort, where we cannot protect her." "She'll die if something goes wrong," Hewitt protested. "At least let the doctor attend her." A Lakota woman pushed into the room, one of the delegation who had been waiting outside. Young Washte followed close behind, both women taking in the situation immediately. They spoke rapidly in Lakota, and Thashichamna nodded. "The women will care for her," he said to the assembled white men. "You have daughters, you have wives, you know birth is women's business. We will return when the child is born, and talks can continue." Caroline was helped outside to where the Lakota delegation had made camp, just beyond the fort's walls, but close enough for safety. A lodge had been erected for sleeping, and now it became a birthing place. Women who had accompanied the delegation gathered, bringing water and cloths, herbs and reassurance. The labor was long and hard, the baby large, and Caroline's body weakened by months of poor nutrition. She labored through the afternoon and into the evening, pain coming in waves that left her gasping. Ringyang Washte and the other women coached her, encouraged her, sometimes scolded her when she wanted to give up. Thashichamna stayed close despite custom that usually kept men away from birthing. his presence a comfort, even as Caroline's world narrowed to nothing but the overwhelming demand of bringing a child into a hostile world. Night had fully fallen when Caroline finally felt the overwhelming urge to push, her body taking over, doing what it knew how to do despite her exhaustion. The women guided her, told her when to push and when to breathe, their experienced hands knowing exactly what was needed. With a final push that felt like it might tear her in half, Caroline felt the baby slide free, heard its first cry, thin and indignant. Announcing its arrival, tears streamed down her face as Wingyang Washte lifted the child, cleaned its face, held it up in the firelight. A son. The elder announced in Lakota, strong lungs, all fingers and toes. A warrior born in troubled times. The baby was placed on Caroline's chest, still connected by the cord, his tiny face scrunched and red, his fists waving as if already fighting the world. Caroline looked down at him through tears. This tiny person who was both her and Thashichamna, both white and Lakota, both hope and vulnerability made flesh. Thashichamna knelt beside her, his good arm reaching out to touch his son's head with infinite gentleness. When he looked at Caroline, there were tears in his eyes too. "You give me a son," he said, his voice breaking. "You give me future when I thought there was none." "What will we name him?" Caroline asked weakly, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "Tashunke Kingyang," Thashichamna said. "Flying horse, for freedom and speed, for the old ways we fight to preserve and the new ways he must learn. For his mother who flew across distance to find us and his father who refuses to stop moving toward justice." The afterbirth came, the cord was cut. Caroline was cleaned and given broth and wrapped in soft robes. The baby nursed hungrily, his small mouth finding her breast with an instinct older than thought. Outside the lodge, word spread through both the Lakota camp and the fort. A child had been born, life continued despite everything. The next morning, weak but determined, Caroline insisted on returning to the negotiations. She could not nurse the baby and translate simultaneously, so Wingyang Washte stayed with little Tashunke Kingyang in the lodge. Bringing him to Caroline every few hours to nurse, something had shifted in the negotiating room. The colonel and the lawyer looked at Caroline with new respect, perhaps understanding for the first time the depth of her commitment. Perhaps moved by the universal power of birth to remind people of shared humanity. Even Richardson seemed less adversarial, more willing to listen. Over the next week, they hammered out terms that, while far from perfect, at least approached fairness. A large territory would be preserved for the Lakota. Boundaries would be clearly marked and enforced against white settlers, as well as against Indians leaving the reservation. Supplies would be delivered monthly with Caroline as one of the inspectors to ensure quantities matched promises. Hunting rights would be preserved in certain areas. Seasonal movement would be allowed within boundaries. It was compromise, painful and incomplete, requiring the Lakota to give up much of their traditional territory and freedom. But it was also survival, a chance for the children to grow up, for the people to adapt and endure, for life to continue even in changed form. The treaty was signed on a bright August morning, chiefs making their marks beside the signatures of government officials. Caroline translated every word one final time, ensuring no deceptions hid in legal language, ensuring both sides understood exactly what they were agreeing to. As the last signature dried, Colonel Thornton approached Caroline. She was nursing the baby, Thashunke Kingyang suckling contentedly, the picture of peace despite the momentous events surrounding him. Mrs. Thornton paused, uncertain how to address her. "Which Haglagapinajing?" Caroline supplied. "Or Caroline, if that's easier for you." "Caroline, then," the colonel said. "I want you to know that I fought against these terms initially. I thought they were too generous, that we were showing weakness." He looked at the baby, then met her eyes. "But watching you these past weeks, seeing what you've sacrificed, what you've endured, it made me remember why I joined the army originally. To protect people, not destroy them. Maybe this treaty will fail like all the others, but at least this time we tried to do it right." "Thank you," Caroline said simply. knowing that individual decency, while insufficient to solve systemic problems, still mattered, still made difference at the margins. The journey back to the mountain stronghold was triumphal. They brought news of peace, of treaty terms that would allow survival, of hope that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Caroline rode with her baby strapped to her chest in a cradleboard that Wingyang Washte had made, feeling his warmth against her, his small heartbeat steady and strong. The stronghold erupted in celebration when they arrived, children running to greet them, women ululating, warriors firing rifles into the air in expression of joy and relief. For this one moment, the weight of loss and struggle lifted, replaced by simple gratitude for continued existence. That night, as the band celebrated around a huge fire, Caroline sat with Tashichamna, watching their son sleep in his cradleboard. The baby's face was peaceful, unaware of the complex world he had been born into, the challenges he would face, the identity questions he would have to navigate. "He will have a hard road," Tashichamna said quietly. "Neither white nor Lakota in the eyes of many, always having to prove himself, always questioned. But he will have us," Caroline replied, "and he will have both worlds, both ways of knowing, both sets of strengths. Maybe that's what the future needs. People who can bridge, who can translate, who can stand between worlds and see truth on both sides." "You still believe that's possible?" Tashichamna asked. "After everything you've seen, everything that's happened?" "I have to believe it," Caroline said, looking at their son. "Because if we don't, then what are we building for him? We've brought him into a broken world. The least we can do is try to make it better, even knowing we might fail." Months passed, then a year, then two. The treaty held better than previous ones. Though not perfectly, there were violations on both sides. Tensions that flared and had to be negotiated, but there was also growth, adaptation, the painful process of learning to coexist. Caroline became an essential figure in this process, serving as translator, as mediator, as living proof that crossing between worlds was possible. She learned to navigate both cultures with increasing skill, raising Tashunka Kingyang to be fluent in both Lakota and English, comfortable in both lodge and fort. A second child came, then a third, each birth easier than the last. Each child, another link binding together the worlds their parents straddled. Tashichamna's shoulder healed, though it ached in cold weather, reminding him of how close they had all come to destruction. The buffalo continued to decline, and with them the old ways of life that had sustained the Lakota for generations. It was loss, profound and permanent, requiring grief and adaptation in equal measure. But life continued, changed but not destroyed, difficult but not impossible. 5 years after her arrival at Fort Laramie, Caroline stood on a hill overlooking the reservation where the band now made their home. Below, she could see lodges mixed with log cabins, children playing games both traditional and new, women working at familiar tasks in unfamiliar settings. Tashichamna came to stand beside her, his arm comfortable around her waist, their youngest daughter balanced on his hip. Together they watched their world, imperfect and compromised. "But alive? Do you regret it?" he asked, knowing she would understand the question encompassed everything. The choice to come west, to marry him, to stand with his people through their darkest times. Caroline thought about the girl she had been, desperate and alone in Philadelphia, about the woman she had become, scarred and strong in ways that girl could never have imagined. She thought about her children, products of two worlds learning to navigate both, about the people who had taken her in and made her their own. "No," she said finally, "it's been hard, sometimes harder than I thought I could survive. But it's been real. It's been mine. I've lived, rather than just existing. I've stood for something larger than myself. I've built something that matters." She looked up at her husband, this man who had offered her not salvation but partnership, not rescue but respect. "And I've loved," she added softly, "really loved. Not the desperate clinging I thought was love before, but the deep choosing that comes from truly knowing someone." He kissed her then, gentle and sure, while their daughter giggled and their other children called from below. Wanting their parents to come play, the sun was setting over the plains, painting everything gold and red, beautiful despite everything, hopeful despite all the reasons not to be. Caroline Wolf had come west as a widow bride no one wanted, had become Wichaglegapi Najing, she who stands after return, and in standing, in choosing, in building a life from the ruins of two worlds, she had found something more valuable than comfort or safety. She had found purpose. She had found belonging. She had found a story worth living, and every day, as she worked and loved and fought to make space for her children in a world that didn't quite know what to do with them, she proved that it was possible to carry someone's name, to bridge impossible distances, to stand between worlds and create something new. The wind carried the sounds of the camp up the hill, laughter and voices, the eternal sound of life continuing, and Caroline smiled, knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow brought, she would face them standing, enduring, alongside the people she had chosen and who had chosen her in return. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.